Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is William E. Forbath, Lloyd M. Bentsen Chair in Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Among the nation's leading legal and constitutional historians, Forbath is the author of Law and the Shaping of the American Labor Movement from 1991, the book in progress, Social and Economic Rights in the American Grain, and the forthcoming Courting the State, Law in the Making of the Modern American State. His scholarly work appears in the Yale Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, the Stanford Law Review, Law and Social Inquiry, and the Journal of American History. His journalism appears on Politico.com and in American Prospect and The Nation. Forbath's current research concerns social and economic rights in the courts and social movements in South Africa. Forbath gave a talk titled Human Rights, the Socialism of the 21st Century at the U of O on April 7, 2011. His talk was the Oregon Humanities Center 2010-11 Colin Rowe Thomas O'Fallon Memorial Lecture in Law and American Culture, as well as part of our year-long series on sustenance. Willie, thanks for doing this.
It's a pleasure.
We're really glad that you were willing to stop and talk to us on camera as well as doing your lecture.
Thank you.
I want to launch this interview by asking you a really big question. I know you're very well prepared to handle this. How has the Constitution changed over the last 2 centuries? Just a small topic.
Well, let me answer the question in a way that keeps us focused in some measure on the themes I talked about last night. What I talked about last night was how important and unique was the moment in the 20th century when many nations, including the U.S., for the first time said everybody is entitled to full membership in society and all the kinds of goods that go with it. And as much as we like to think of the U.S. as the world's oldest constitutional democracy, one of the things that I'd underscore about how our Constitution has changed over 2 centuries is that we didn't begin as a democracy. We began as one of the first and certainly the most durable republic. And for its day, ours was a very inclusive constitution. In other words, every white man who owned property voted under our Constitution. But in many, many ways, ours was a constitution that was framed by far-sighted conservatives who were distressed by just how revolutionary the American Revolution had become. The American Revolution was an enormously radical moment in which not only was it a revolution that declared independence from the British Empire and created a republic in place of a monarchy, it was also a revolution that's a revolution at home, in which small farmers, folks who were then called mechanics, rose into leadership in a militia-like army in which, astonishingly, the soldiers elected their officers. And so the moment after the revolution saw the creation of state constitutions, which were the first of our constitutions, that put ordinary people in charge of government. And the project of the men who went to Philadelphia was twofold. Probably most important of all was to yoke these states closer together to create a genuine national government that had the muscle to confront the rest of the world. Because like post-colonials in every period, they were always looking over their shoulder at the big powers elsewhere, and they were afraid that the new United States would be carved up and divided and conquered by European powers if it didn't become stronger. But the other concern was to create a more elitist kind of government, a government in which the best men, which were men like the ones who went to Philadelphia, who were without exception very wealthy slaveholders and merchants and members of the elite, they wanted a government in which more of the important powers over economic development and commercial life rested with men who thought large, who weren't thinking about local affairs. And it was localists who dominated the first decade or so of government in the new republic. And so they created a very elite form of republicanism, not a democracy. They took power over important economic policy matters away from the states, and they filtered the opinions of ordinary people through all kinds of ways. Nobody, not the president, not the courts, not the Senate, was elected by the people. It was a constitution in the name of we the people, but the process of choosing leaders, and therefore decision makers, was several steps removed from the people. And the people, of course, didn't include most of the people. Blacks, women, men without property, none of them was eligible to vote at all. So it was far from a democracy, and that was deliberate. And the great second founding, which is actually the phrase, the title of a book by one of your former University of Oregon colleagues, Garrett Epps. So this is also a shout out to Garrett and his wonderful book called The Second Founding. And the second founding was the democratic moment. It was the moment when for the first time the word equality appears in the Constitution and equal rights becomes a commitment of the Constitution. And in principle, the ex-slaves, the lowliest of the social order, are made full and equal citizens by the Civil War amendments. And then decades pass before those amendments' promises are brought to earth. And so how our Constitution changed over 2 centuries is a very, very long struggle to make it a democratic Constitution.
You identify various key moments in that process and in this country's engagement with social democracy. One of them that you highlight is what was called the Second Bill of Rights that was launched by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in '44, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's some lovely quotations from his, what was initially a radio address, I think, things like, "We cannot be content if some faction of our people is ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and insecure." So that was the beginning of another phase of this development, 50, 60 years ago now. In your public address, you made the point that at the end of the 20th century, we're back in a kind of a crisis about social democracy and the undoing of the welfare state. You seem to see a watershed between the late 20th and now into the early 21st centuries. What's the lay of the land now?
The lay of the land, as far as what I call social and economic rights are concerned, and as far as the rights that make up Franklin Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, the lay of the land there is one important story, and I think it's the one we'll focus on. There are obviously other dimensions of how the constitutional landscape looks today. We could just sort of mark off that there are deep issues about the building up of executive power, particularly with respect to national security and war making, that we're in the thick of. We have a great progressive president who ran on the platform of, I'm going to roll back the imperial presidency and the excesses of the Bush years in respect of claims of unilateral executive power. Power to torture, power to detain, power to make war, with no obligations to consult or involve Congress. And strikingly, Obama has gone to war without consulting Congress, without fully engaging in the constitutional processes of how the republic goes to war. What one makes of that, how forgiving and even supportive one might be about those choices is a whole other part of the constitutional landscape, not today. So, social and economic rights. Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights sets out a vision of the role of government in modern society that tracks what's afoot in the same period in Western Europe. And the phrase social democracy really is a European phrase. It had much less currency here in the US. And similarly, the phrase social citizenship, right? Or social rights, all those phrases with the social, at the center, never have the same traction here as they do abroad. And that's a function of America's enduring ambivalence about the idea that the basic rights of citizens are not only the classic ones of civil equality and political equality, and civil rights and political rights. Those are the familiar rights to be free from, in the case of civil rights, free from, right, government interference with your liberty to talk as you please, your liberty to think as you please, believe what you please, and to be free from intrusions, interferences in your home, with your person, those kinds of what philosophers call negative liberties are very much the comfortable space of American thoughts about freedom. That plus the right to vote, political rights. The sort of flag with the serpent on it, don't tread on me, right? The don't tread on me symbol of what freedom means is the most resonant one most of the time in American history. And it's not coincidence that it's the flag and the outlook of the Tea Party today, right? The social rights idea is that everyone has a right to, right, a decent livelihood, decent work, decent education, healthcare, housing, ill-clad, ill-fed, ill-housed. Roosevelt was speaking against the backdrop of the Great Depression. The Great Depression had brought to power, right, in Europe fascist movements, and it had, right, intensified the popularity of socialism and communism, even in many quarters in the U.S. And it was in reaction to those developments, the ways in which material insecurity brought on by a Great Depression could drive people here and abroad toward profoundly illiberal forms of government, right? Fascism and totalitarianism, communism and socialism, even the more humane forms of socialism were deeply disconcerting to American liberals. And so, like with social democracy in England and Europe, the New Deal, Second Bill of Rights vision, was an effort by reformers who wanted to preserve capitalism and liberal democracy and not see them replaced by, right, alternative regimes that were either proved to be morally and practically disastrous or at least threatened to be that, right? Social democracy was a great compromise to embrace the socialist goals of a decent set of social goods and social, as it was called in Europe, social provision for everyone in order to make, right, and complete liberal democracy, make everyone equipped to participate more equally and feel secure. So Roosevelt said in the same speech, a necessitous man is not a free man. And we would say a necessitous person is not a free person. Without those, the minimum of material goods, right, she or he is dependent on anybody or anything that can answer those basic human needs. The Second Bill of Rights, then, says we're going to equip all Americans with what they need in order to be truly free, but it never really fully is brought down to earth. In other words, after 1937 or 38, Franklin Roosevelt never again is able to muster a majority in Congress to enact what he hoped to enact, namely health care. He had a national health care vision. He had a vision of completing what was called completing the New Deal welfare state, so that the Social Security program, the biggest success of his sort of Second Bill of Rights legislation, still excluded people in many different sectors. So did his labor laws. People in agriculture, people in domestic service, the extent to which old age insurance really covered everybody, all were left incomplete in the 30s. But by the end of the 30s, the Southern Democrats who had been among the most ardent supporters of the New Deal, stepped away and said to Roosevelt, no further. We can't abide this kind of generous social rights program. It will undermine our racial civilization, they said. It will undermine the advantages God has given our economy, all of which meant it will undermine our ability to exploit black labor and hold the Negro down. So that the great fault line that was built into the American Constitution and meant to have been removed by the Civil War and Reconstruction rears up again, creates a fissure in the Democratic Party itself. The Southern Democrats ally with the Northern Republicans, or the conservatives among them, and thwart the completion of Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights. Right? So it remains what historians often call an unfinished revolution, a very partial and in some ways a patchwork style of welfare state compared to abroad.
Let me skip ahead a whole bunch of decades to a piece that you published in 2008. It was at the moment of the campaign for the presidential election. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama were both setting very optimistic, very idealistic platforms. And you identified that as a hopeful moment and suggested that social rights may be coming back. Now, that was 2008. We're in 2011. 3 years later, you've identified today as a conservative moment, a constitutional moment, a moment when we're not making it a matter of principle to assure social and civil rights, but are playing with the mechanics of government. How did we get from 08 to 11?
Well, it is funny, right, that we did elect a progressive president, right, a pragmatist but a progressive one, who chose to make healthcare and a universal healthcare coverage his signature issue, right, even in the thick of an economic crisis. And whereas during the election, in that moment of optimism you mentioned when I wrote that piece, both Obama and Clinton were talking in a much more rightsy kind of way about higher education and about healthcare. Both of them seem to be opening up some space to complete that New Deal project in this respect. Both of them said education is becoming unaffordable, healthcare is becoming unaffordable, higher education is becoming unaffordable, healthcare has become unaffordable for huge numbers of Americans. And we can't endure as a kind of de facto social democracy, as a nation that isn't quite comfortable talking about social rights or social citizenship the way those Europeans do, but nonetheless, in principle, are committed to some sort of pre-distribution that's outside the market. That's what everyone is entitled to in order to have a fair start in the case of education, or in order to enjoy some bit of security in the case of healthcare. And I think Obama might have preferred to keep the battle for his healthcare legislation somewhat more on principled grounds than he did. I think he would have been beautiful, wouldn't he, if he'd been able to give and had chosen to give more speeches that called Americans to their basic values and raised the challenge. Won't we take on board, providing health care for everybody, rather than going on the defensive of this is affordable, this is manageable, this will cut costs over the long run. and and the sort of moral dimension of his case was reduced too much, it seemed to me, to the kind of anecdotes, stories of, suffering individuals who've been denied coverage, all of which are gripping and important, but it doesn't give you a principle to hold on to in the same way as some of his campaign rhetoric did. It seems to me it was probably a calculated choice not to push on the broad principle, to push on a much thinner principle of inclusion, even when elements of his legislation were being sort of sacrificed to getting the job done. And meanwhile, what's interesting, what was unpredictable, what's kind of interesting to a constitutional historian and kind of comic, is that while the progressives and their president were tamping down the idea that this was a turning point in American history in which we would bring everyone into the universe of an entitlement to health care, the right said this is a constitutional moment. This is what Obama is seeking to do. Obamacare, as they called it, is the sort of opening wedge of socialism in America. And it's an intolerable coercion. It's the don't tread on me. It's intolerable to force Americans to buy health insurance. That is the sort of very definition of an overreaching government. And we've got to draw a line in the sand. And they brought on board, as often happens, the Constitution in the streets and in the social movements flows rather swiftly, sometimes much more quickly than constitutional lawyers expect, into the doctrine, so that we now have in the case law these two district court decisions declaring Obamacare unconstitutional. And one of them is really a movement judge who really shouts out to the Tea Party. So there's a line in his opinion, the men who threw the tea off the Boston Harbor would never have abided a government that forces us to buy health care.
You've said that there's a different dynamic at the state level than there is at the national level. That social rights lawyering, in your lovely phrase, is happening at the state level. So how's it, what's going on there that is in contradistinction to what you've just talked about?
There are no social rights, of course, in the American Constitution's text. And even a creative lawyer is always more comfortable when she can work with some text. And the reason that the constitutions of South Africa or India or Europe, right, or Latin America have given rise to the kind of remarkable lawyering I've described is partly because they are brimming with rights to education, rights to housing, all these things that the American Constitution lacks. Not so with respect to America's state constitutions. Every American state constitution includes a right to education. It includes at least one social right, and sometimes others. And what that's meant is that over the past 2-3 decades, there have been lawyers who've grabbed hold of those bits of text, sometimes very old text, and breathed life into them, and brought suits challenging the unbelievably extreme inequalities that are the upshot of the way we in America fund education. The public, elementary and high school education is funded, as everyone knows, by property taxes, by and large. And property taxes depend on the very most local of factors. Do you live in a property-rich town or district, or a poor one? And it means that the unreformed, before this round of litigation in many, many states, unreformed, unconstitutionally scrutinized education in, let's take my home state of Texas. You had Edgewood School District, Alamo Heights School District. roughly a few $1,000 per kid, roughly $10,000 per kid. And that wasn't even the most extreme. That happened to be the districts where the case was brought. And so relying on the state constitutions, because they'd lost in the U.S. Supreme Court, rights lawyers brought challenges, and the courts, by and large, embraced those challenges and said the right to education in the state constitution entitles each child to an adequate education, that there are constitutional minima and there are constitutional restraints of equity that have to, in some measure, make more equal the resources for each kid's education.
I'm going to put you to a difficult task here. We've got about a minute left. Can you predict what's going to happen in the next few years?
The short answer is easy, no. The longer answer is that the future course of the national constitution may be in the balance. It's really striking how important it could be whether Obama is elected for a second term and gets to shape the court for the next decades, or if a conservative Republican is elected, and many things hang in the balance. Everything from the imperial presidency, war-making powers, the future of gay America. So the court will be shaped over the next few years for good or ill.
We'll have to bring you back in a couple of years and pick it up there.
Thank you.
Willie, thank you for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks.
We've been speaking with William E. Forbath, the Lloyd M. Bentsen Chair in Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Forbath gave a talk titled Human Rights, the Socialism of the 21st Century at the U of O on April 7, 2011. His talk was the Oregon Humanities Center 2010-11 Colin Rowe Thomas O'Fallon Memorial Lecture in Law and American Culture. It was also a part of our year-long sustenance series. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.